Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was the beginning of a cold, crisp fall when it all started. The kind of autumn night when the air smells like fresh rain and decaying leaves, and the world is silent except for the occasional rustle in the trees or the whisper of the wind. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The building was old, probably a few decades past its prime, but it was quiet and the rent was cheap, which was all I needed at the time. I remember the first night in the apartment vividly. It was around 10 p.m. and I was just finishing unpacking the last few boxes. The place was small but cozy enough. I'd set up the living room with my old couch and a few pictures on the walls. The bedroom was mostly just my bed with a dresser, and the kitchen had everything I needed for the moment. As I sat down on the couch to catch my breath, I realized how strangely quiet it was. Almost too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making everything feel eerie, like you're being watched. I shook off the feeling and turned on the TV, hoping it would drown out the silence. I had just started scrolling through Netflix when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the sound persisted. It wasn't constant, more like a slow, deliberate pace, coming from above, just above my ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but the more I listened, the more the sound began to creep me out. It was just too steady, too consistent. I told myself it was probably just one of the other tenants, maybe someone moving around in their apartment. But when the footsteps kept going long after I'd turned the volume down on the TV, my nerves started to get the best of me. I sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, straining to listen. The steps didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to get louder. Step, step, step. Over and over. It wasn't random, like someone walking across their floor. No, it was rhythmic, like someone pacing. I tried to distract myself with the show again, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to those footsteps. I glanced at the clock. Almost 11 p.m. Maybe whoever lived upstairs had just gotten home, or maybe they were just pacing back and forth trying to wind down. That seemed logical. But logic didn't stop the tight feeling in my chest. A few minutes later, the footsteps abruptly stopped. I waited. Seconds passed, then a minute. Then, just when I thought I'd heard the last of them, there was a loud bang above me, like something heavy had fallen. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat, and immediately my thoughts raced. Was someone up there hurt? Did something fall? I quickly got up and went to the window, half expecting to see someone rushing out of the building or a flash of lights. But the street outside was empty, as dark and quiet as ever. I stood by the window for a few moments, watching the shadows dance in the streetlights. When I turned back to the apartment, I felt it. A chill in the air, colder than the temperature outside. It wasn't the kind of chill that you get from an open window or a draft. It felt unnatural, as though the air itself had grown heavier. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I didn't know what came over me, but I couldn't stay in the apartment. I grabbed my keys and went for a walk, needing to clear my head. I didn't know why, but I felt the overwhelming need to leave the apartment for just a little while. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but every step I took down the street felt like I was distancing myself from whatever strange feeling I'd left behind. I returned about an hour later, just as the streetlights flickered on. When I walked back into the apartment, everything seemed normal. The silence had returned, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It felt like the place was simply settling down for the night. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the unsettling feeling creeping back in. I don't know when it started, but at some point in the early morning hours, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. Step, step, step. This time, though, they were closer. They were in the hallway. I lay still in my bed trying to convince myself it was just the neighbor's footfalls in the hall or the creaking of the building. But the sound was so deliberate, so purposeful. I held my breath and listened, but after a while I realized that the steps weren't stopping. They were getting closer to my door, slowly, one step at a time. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost delicate. A knock at my door. It was just one knock, followed by a long silence. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. Who was at my door? My mind raced. and I pulled the covers up to my chin, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. I don't know how long I lay there, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Every part of me was telling me to get up, open the door, check who it was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt trapped, like whatever was out there knew I was here and was waiting for me to make a move. But nothing came of it. No more knocks, no more footsteps. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual. I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe I had just been tired, stressed out from the move, and it was all in my head. But the weird thing was, the moment I stepped into the hallway that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around, but there was no one there. Just the usual quiet emptiness of the building. The footsteps started again the next night, and the night after that. Step, step, step. Always at the same time. Always the same sound, the pacing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. On the third night, I finally worked up the nerve to go upstairs. I couldn't just keep sitting in my apartment, listening to whatever or whoever was pacing around above me. I grabbed my phone and stood outside the door to the unit upstairs. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. 3 knocks, the same way the sound had come from below me the night before. There was no answer. I knocked again. This time I heard something. A faint shuffle of movement behind the door, followed by a pause. Then the door creaked open, just slightly, as if whoever was inside was trying to peek out without fully opening it. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little shaky. There was no response, but I could see a shadow moving behind the door. A figure just barely visible, watching me. The air felt thick again, just like it had in my own apartment. I started, but before I could finish, the door slammed shut in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before knocking again. This time, no one answered. I had no idea what was going on. Why hadn't they said anything? Why had they acted so strangely? I made my way back downstairs, feeling more unsettled than ever. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell the landlord? Should I call the police? I went back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. That night, I decided to leave the TV on to drown out the footsteps. It helped a little, but not enough. The footsteps returned again, just like every other night. But this time, something was different. I heard a voice. Soft, just barely audible. Help. The voice came from above. I froze. It was so quiet that I thought maybe I had imagined it, but it wasn't just the footsteps. It was something else. Something in the voice, in the tone. It sounded desperate. Help. It came again, louder this time, clearer. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, but before I could dial, the footsteps started again, pacing back and forth above me, more frenzied this time. I waited, tense, my breath shallow, but nothing came after that. By morning, I was exhausted. The unsettling feeling in my stomach hadn't gone away, and the silence was deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I never heard the footsteps again after that night. The apartment remained eerily quiet. The tenant upstairs never answered my knocks again, and after a few weeks, I stopped hearing anything at all from that unit. But every time I walk past that door, I can still feel the weight of those footsteps behind me, echoing in the silence. The apartment might be empty now, but every time I close my eyes, I can hear that voice. Help. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I had always enjoyed the idea of escaping to a remote cabin in the woods. It sounded like the perfect way to unwind and disconnect from the hustle and bustle of daily life. A weekend spent alone in nature, no distractions, no interruptions, just me, my thoughts, and the solitude. That's why, when a friend of mine offered to let me stay in his family's cabin for the weekend, I jumped at the opportunity. It was located deep in a secluded forest, miles from the nearest neighbor or town, surrounded only by trees and wildlife. I couldn't have been more excited. The drive out there was long, the kind of road that twisted and turned, surrounded by dense woods on both sides. The further I went, the more I felt the weight of isolation. There was no cell service out there, and my GPS didn't work. I found it oddly refreshing, no distractions. It was just me and the road. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was as picturesque as I had imagined. The cabin itself was a small, rustic wooden structure with a stone chimney and a large front porch. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the trees, and the air was crisp and cool. After I unloaded my bags, I set up a fire in the hearth, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, just the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. It felt like paradise. The first night went by without incident. I read a little, sipped on a drink, and listened to the wind howling through the trees outside. I even took a walk around the property, just as darkness fell, and everything felt perfectly normal. Peaceful, even. There was a certain magic about being so isolated, so cut off from the world. It made me feel connected to something deeper, more primal. But by the second night, something felt off. It was around midnight when I first heard it. I had just gotten into bed, the room dimly lit by the orange glow of the fire. The cabin creaked with the weight of the wind, and the occasional sound of branches scratching against the walls was almost soothing. But then I heard it, a soft, distinct noise coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear it again. But the sound had stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else, bumping against the cabin. After all, the woods were teeming with wildlife. Still, the sound had unsettled me. I tried to push it out of my mind and drifted off to sleep. But the knocking came again. This time it was louder, closer, and there was no mistaking it. Tap, tap, tap. I shot upright in bed, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I glanced at the window, but all I could see was darkness, thick and oppressive. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. My first instinct was to call out, maybe yell, to see if it was some prankster. But as I lay there in the silence, I realized how foolish that would be. I was alone, miles from anyone. No one would hear me. The knocking continued, now more urgent. Tap, tap, tap. The pattern was too specific, too repetitive. It didn't sound like an animal. I quietly got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was dark, but I moved carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I crept to the window and peeked out through a small gap in the curtain, shining a flashlight into the darkness outside. For a moment, all I could see was the blur of rain in the beam of light, the trees swaying in the wind. There was no one out there. I let out a sigh of relief and stepped back from the window, about to return to bed, when I heard it again, this time from the back door. Tap, tap, tap. I froze in my tracks. This time, I didn't even try to look. The back door was located near the kitchen, and I couldn't bear the thought of going anywhere near it. My mind raced. What kind of person would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, knocking on the door in the middle of the night? Who would even know I was here? I considered my options. I could go outside and confront whatever it was. But something told me that would be a mistake. There was no phone signal out here. There was no one around for miles. I was completely alone. I stayed hidden in the shadows, waiting. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued for what felt like hours, always at the same steady pace. Tap, tap, tap. I was terrified, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Should I call the police? Should I go outside and investigate? No, I had no idea what was out there, and I wasn't going to take any chances. At some point, the knocking stopped. Just like that, the air grew still, and I could hear nothing but the wind outside. My heart was still racing, my breathing shallow. The fear didn't subside, though. It lingered, gnawing at me as I waited in the dark, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. I decided to sleep with the lights on, clutching a heavy flashlight in my hand. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. I barely slept at all that night. It was as though the weight of the unknown had settled into my bones. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I hadn't gotten a full night's sleep, and my mind felt foggy. I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had been out there, knocking at the door. I didn't want to spend another night at the cabin, but I didn't have much of a choice. It was still early in the day, and I didn't want to drive back on the winding roads in the dark. So I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. I grabbed a jacket and headed out the front door, hoping that the fresh air would help me shake off the creeping unease. The walk didn't do much to ease my tension, but it was nice to get away from the cabin for a while. The forest was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I tried to focus on the beauty of the surroundings, the towering trees and the sunlight filtering through the branches. But then I noticed something strange. As I walked along the path, I spotted a set of footprints in the mud. At first, I thought it was just from some animal, but as I looked closer, I realized they were human footprints. The prints were fresh, clearly visible in the soft earth, and they led in the direction of the cabin. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart started racing again. I knew I was the only one at the cabin. No one else was supposed to be here. But these footprints were undeniable. They weren't mine. I didn't want to go back to the cabin. The idea of being trapped in that small, isolated place with whoever or whatever was out there terrified me. But I had to go back. I couldn't stay out here in the woods forever. I hurried back to the cabin, my feet pounding the earth beneath me. When I reached the front door, I immediately checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I spent the rest of the day pacing, too anxious to relax, too scared to leave. That night, the knocking started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I didn't even go to the window. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, and the terror I felt was overwhelming. The knocking persisted for hours, each tap making my heart race faster. Finally, at some point in the early hours of the morning, the knocking stopped. I never went back to that cabin. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
It started off as an ordinary night. I had just finished working a long shift at the diner, and by the time I locked up and left, it was nearly 2 a.m. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car speeding by or a stray dog rummaging through the trash. I lived on the outskirts of town, in a small apartment complex that was tucked away behind a row of old houses. It was quiet, but that's why I liked it. My apartment was the top unit, so I had a good view of the surrounding area, but there were only a few other tenants in the building, most of them elderly or people who worked night shifts like I did. I just moved in a few months ago. The rent was cheap, and it wasn't far from my job. It wasn't the best place, but it was all I could afford at the time. The building had character, old wooden floors, squeaky doors, and a strange smell that never quite went away no matter how much I cleaned. I'd grown used to it. As I made my way up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed that the hallway light was flickering. This had been happening more often recently, but I hadn't thought much of it. It's an old building. Things were bound to malfunction. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. The apartment felt cold. The heat had been acting up lately, and the small radiator in the corner didn't do much to warm the place. I was used to it, though. I dropped my bag by the door, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down at the small table by the window. The city lights from below cast an orange glow against the walls, and I felt a strange sense of calm. It was just me and the sound of the tea kettle whistling in the background. I finished my tea, took a shower, and crawled into bed. The clock on my nightstand read 3:30 a.m. I was tired, but there was something unsettling about the silence that kept me from drifting off right away. The sound of the city below had a quiet hum to it, but above me there was nothing. No footsteps in the hallway, no cars passing by, just stillness. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the silence. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the far side of the room. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the wall. I dismissed it as the house settling, or maybe an animal in the walls. There were a lot of old houses around, and they sometimes attracted rodents. I rolled over, trying to ignore it, but the scratching persisted, growing louder. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but as I lay there in the dark, I realized the sound was coming from right above me, the ceiling. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of the building. It was deliberate. Scratching, scraping. It sent a chill up my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise continued, faster now. I tried to tell myself it was just some animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It sounded too human, too purposeful. The scratching stopped, and for a moment everything was silent again. But then came a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped on the floor above me. I flinched, my muscles tense. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone in the apartment above me? A neighbor maybe? Or something worse? I waited in the dark, my eyes glued to the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I lay back down slowly, my heart still pounding in my chest. The silence returned, but it felt wrong now. Unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, wide awake, staring into the dark. The silence pressed in on me, and every sound, the wind outside, the creaking of the building, felt amplified. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the stillness, and I jumped. It was a message from a friend. "Hey, you okay? You seem off lately." I didn't respond. I didn't feel like talking. Instead, I just stared at the message, the weight of the silence in the room growing heavier by the second. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just nerves, that the exhaustion from my late shift had made me overly sensitive to the sounds around me. But when I woke up and went to the bathroom, I noticed something strange. A small mark on the ceiling. It wasn't a crack or anything structural. It looked like a faint smear, almost like something had been dragged across it. I stood there for a few moments, staring at it, but I couldn't make sense of it. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just dirt from the ventilation system. Still, the unease in my stomach didn't go away. It lingered throughout the day. That night, I tried to distract myself. I didn't want to go to bed and hear that scratching noise again, but eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I went to sleep. The whole time, I kept the light on, just enough so I could see the shadows in the room, the outline of the furniture. I tried to tell myself everything was fine, but the longer I lay there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. And then it happened again. The scratching. It was quieter this time, almost like it was moving across the floor, not the ceiling. I held my breath, my heart racing. The sound was so soft, so deliberate. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness in the corner of the room. There was nothing there. Just shadows. The noise stopped. I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard a low whisper. It was barely audible, like someone was speaking right next to me, but I couldn't make out the words. It was a chilling, raspy sound, like someone trying to communicate from a distance. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My phone buzzed again, and I almost jumped out of my skin. It was my friend again, asking if everything was all right. I quickly typed back, "Yeah, just tired. Work's been rough." I didn't feel like talking to anyone. I didn't want anyone to know what was happening. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore, not with that feeling crawling under my skin, making every inch of the place feel suffocating. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked if anyone else had complained about strange noises. He seemed confused at first, but then told me I wasn't the first person to mention it. He said a few tenants had left recently, claiming that they felt uneasy in the building. One of them, an elderly woman, had even mentioned hearing noises at night, though she couldn't explain them. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. That night, I packed my things and left. As I was leaving, I saw the landlord outside talking to a maintenance worker. I didn't want to stick around, but something made me stop. I overheard the landlord telling the worker that the building had been built over an old property, a house that had burned down years ago under mysterious circumstances. They never found out what happened, but the fire had claimed the lives of the previous tenants. I didn't know if that was just some rumor or if it was true. But as I walked away, I couldn't help but feel that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I had imagined. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, even in my new place. Every so often I'll hear a faint scratching sound or a whisper in the dark. It's never loud, never enough to be certain, but I know it's there. And it always reminds me of that apartment, the one I thought was just another quiet, forgotten building, but one that held something far darker. Story. The end.
Story number 4.
I've always enjoyed the quiet of the woods, the isolation, and the serenity that came with spending time far from city lights and noise. It was one of those things I grew up with. Weekends spent in a cabin my grandparents owned in the mountains. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it was comforting and warm, a place to escape everything. After my grandmother passed away a few years ago, I still visited it when I needed a break. My parents were often busy, so the cabin became my refuge. I'd go there by myself a few times a month to unwind. It felt safe, like a little world of its own, tucked away from the chaos of daily life. That particular Friday, I packed my car and drove up for the weekend, eager for the solitude. I arrived just as dusk settled over the trees, the sun disappearing behind the mountain ridges. The air was cool and smelled of pine, crisp and clean, and I could hear the rustling of leaves from the breeze. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by trees, with a long gravel driveway that wound up to it. The lights inside were dim, and the place looked exactly as it always did, like something out of an old family photograph. It was peaceful, and it didn't take long for me to settle in. I unpacked my bag, stoked the fire in the living room, and made myself some dinner. I had no plans to leave the cabin until Sunday afternoon. It was the perfect weekend escape. The only thing I had to worry about was not letting myself get too much into my head. After dinner, I sat on the couch with a book, the soft glow of the fire flickering across the room. It was early, still only 8 p.m., but I was tired from the long drive. I'd planned on reading for a while, then getting to bed early. The silence in the cabin was the sort of quiet that filled every corner, muffling even the faintest sound. But after a while, I started to hear something, a faint scratching at the door. It was light, almost like the wind, but it persisted. At first, I tried to ignore it. Probably just a tree branch brushing against the door or a small animal out there. But then it came again, scratching, dragging, like something was trying to get in. I stood up, startled, and looked out the window. The porch light cast long shadows across the front yard, but there was nothing there, nothing visible anyway. I shrugged it off, assuming it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I went back to my book, but the scratching didn't stop. It was relentless, like whatever it was had no intention of leaving. I stood up and crossed the room to the door, peering through the small window next to it. There was nothing, no movement in the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the wind, casting strange shadows across the yard. For a moment, I thought about going outside to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was an unsettling thought, but the sense of being watched crept into my mind, and I couldn't get rid of it. I went back to the couch, trying to distract myself by focusing on the book. But the noise continued. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a small animal. This was something deliberate. Each scratch seemed to echo louder and louder until it felt like it was inside the cabin with me. The pressure built up in my chest, my heart beginning to race. I decided to check the other doors and windows just to make sure everything was locked up tight. As I walked past the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. I froze. For a second, I wasn't sure if I had seen anything at all. My mind was racing, and the light from the kitchen only illuminated so much of the yard. But when I looked closer, I saw it again, just a flash of movement near the trees at the edge of the clearing. Someone or something was standing there. The figure was barely visible in the dark, blending in with the shadows of the trees. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just the wind playing tricks with the branches, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't breathe. My hand was shaking as I pulled the curtains shut, hoping that whatever it was, whoever it was, would go away. For the rest of the evening, I tried to distract myself with the TV, but my mind was racing. I kept hearing noises, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something in the yard, movement just beyond the glow of the porch light. I checked the doors and windows again, but everything seemed fine. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. By midnight, I decided I had enough. I locked all the doors, turned off the lights, and crawled into bed. I pulled the covers up tight and tried to calm my mind. I told myself it was nothing. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, just passing through the clearing. But every little sound made my pulse race. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind had me on edge. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was at the back door, just outside the bedroom window. I froze, holding my breath, my body tensed in fear. It wasn't the wind. It was more deliberate, like someone or something was dragging something heavy across the ground. The sound was so sharp, so unnerving, that I couldn't convince myself it was just an animal. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go outside and confront whatever was there, but another part of me, the part that was paralyzed with fear, knew that was a bad idea. I had to wait it out. I had to stay calm. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unsettling. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, trying to listen for any movement, any sound, but the longer I lay there, the more I realized that it was too quiet, too still. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked for a signal. Nothing. My phone was completely dead in this area, which only made things worse. I was completely alone, isolated. There was no way to call for help. Suddenly, I heard something even more terrifying than the scratching. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching against the gravel outside. Someone was walking around the cabin, moving slowly, like they knew exactly where they were going. I held my breath. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. I could hide, wait until morning, but I knew I couldn't just sit there, not with someone so close. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of bed, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I heard a faint rustling, as if someone was kneeling down. Then, the back door handle turned. I stifled a scream, retreating into the corner of the room, praying the person wouldn't hear me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I crept to the window, shining the flashlight out into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man standing by the back door, his back to me. His clothes were dark, and he was wearing a hood, his face hidden in the shadows. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. He wasn't even trying to hide. He was just there, standing, waiting. I didn't know how long I watched him, but when he turned and started walking away from the door, I felt a rush of panic. What was he doing? Why was he there? I stayed where I was, trying to stay as still as possible, my heart racing. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't give myself away. After a while, the footsteps faded into the distance and the cabin fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The fear gnawed at me. Every sound, every shadow in the corner of my eyes made me jump. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, for the figure to return. When the sun finally rose, I wasted no time. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't care about anything else. I couldn't stay there anymore. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I never went back to that cabin. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I've always been the kind of person who doesn't get scared easily. When people talk about ghost stories, strange noises, or unsettling feelings, I usually just brush it off. After all, my apartment was in a quiet part of town, and I lived alone. It wasn't anything special, just a small one-bedroom place in an older building that had seen better days. I was used to the creaks and groans of an old structure. They didn't bother me. I didn't mind the silence either. It was peaceful. That's what I liked about it. But everything changed on one particular night. I remember that evening clearly. I had just gotten off a late shift at work and was exhausted. My mind was in autopilot as I drove back home. The streets were eerily empty, lit only by the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. I wasn't used to being out that late, but it wasn't the first time I had gotten off work at odd hours. When I pulled into the parking lot of my building, the place was dead quiet, as usual. There was no sign of anyone. I figured the building's other tenants were either already asleep or out of town. The lobby was dark when I stepped inside. The flickering light above the front desk gave the room an almost unsettling feeling. I hadn't noticed it before, but it made the entire place feel abandoned, even though I knew people lived here. I glanced around, but didn't see anyone. Just me and the building's usual silence. When I reached my apartment on the second floor, I dropped my bag by the door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of dust, and the dim light from the hallway crept through the cracks in the blinds. Nothing seemed out of place. I turned on the TV, sat on the couch, and scrolled through my phone for a while before finally deciding it was time to go to bed. I locked the door and slipped into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. For some reason, though, I felt uneasy. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, just an odd sense of discomfort. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just because I had worked late and was overtired. At first, I didn't hear anything. It was quiet, just the usual noises of the building settling. But then, after a few minutes, I heard a noise that made my heart skip a beat. It was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. I froze, listening intently, trying to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it might have been a neighbor, maybe someone above or next door. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. It seemed to be coming from inside my apartment. I sat up slowly, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound continued, coming from the far side of the room, near the window. My heart started pounding in my chest. Was someone in the apartment with me? Had I left a window open? No. I was certain I had checked everything before going to bed. The tapping stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening. I lay there in the dark, my thoughts racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the building shifting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I reached over to my nightstand and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. I slowly got out of bed and made my way to the window, my pulse racing. The apartment was still, nothing out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and turned to head back to bed when I noticed something on the floor. It was a small, folded piece of paper, right in the middle of the room, as if someone had placed it there while I wasn't looking. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed it when I got into bed, and it wasn't there when I had gone to the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been in here while I was asleep? No, that wasn't possible. I had locked the door when I came in. I would have heard anyone coming in. Still, the paper was there, and the weirdest part was that it was folded neatly, almost too neatly. I bent down and carefully picked it up, unfolding it. The handwriting was messy, barely legible, but I could make out the words, "I'm watching you." I felt the blood drain from my face as I stood there, staring at the note. I couldn't comprehend what I was reading. My hands began to shake, and I almost dropped the paper. Who would do this? Why would someone do this? The building was small, and I knew the neighbors. None of them seemed like the type to play pranks like this, especially not at this hour. I stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. Was this some kind of sick joke, or was it something more sinister? I didn't know, but the feeling of being watched, of being alone in my apartment but not truly alone, crept over me. It was suffocating. I quickly folded the note back up and shoved it into my pocket, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak in the building, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. I kept expecting someone to knock on the door, to break the silence that had taken on an almost tangible weight. But nothing happened. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I didn't want to go into work, but I forced myself to get out of bed, take a shower, and get dressed. I tried to go about my day as usual, but the feeling from the night before lingered. Every time I looked over my shoulder, every time I heard a noise in the hall or from the apartment above me, my stomach churned. That night, after work, I decided to leave the apartment and go to a friend's place for a few hours. I needed to clear my head. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My friend's place was a welcome distraction. We talked and watched TV until late in the night. But when I finally returned home, I felt the unease creeping back over me. As soon as I stepped into the apartment, I knew something was off. The air felt colder, the apartment quieter than usual. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just listening. Then I heard it, the soft tapping sound again. It was coming from the same spot in the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my landlord. When he didn't answer, I left a message asking him to check the building. I was sure someone was messing with me, but I couldn't figure out who or why. I decided to call the police, but just before I could, I heard a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. The sound of the door to my apartment creaking open. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment was empty. I was sure of it. I hadn't heard anyone come in, but there it was, the unmistakable sound of the door opening. I was terrified. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone breaking in? Was it the same person who had left the note? Slowly, I made my way to the door and peeked around the corner. The door to the hallway was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and I saw nothing. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning the hallway. There was no one in sight. But then I heard a noise from behind me, a soft rustling sound, almost like fabric brushing against the floor. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. The door was closed again. I don't know how I made it through that night. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Every little sound felt like it was coming from just behind me. Every shadow seemed to have a shape. I stayed up all night, sitting in my living room, listening. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps. No more knocking. The apartment remained silent. I never found out who had been in my apartment that night. I never found out who had left the note. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the walls of the apartment were closing in on me. Every time I went to bed, I could hear that tapping, almost like it was calling me. I moved out shortly after that and never went back to that apartment. I've lived in other places since then, but to this day, I still hear that tapping sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but I can still hear it. It's a sound that lingers even when I try to ignore it. And I'll always wonder if it was real or if it was something that will follow me forever. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I don't know why I agreed to it. The offer seemed harmless enough. An easy getaway. My best friend, Sarah, had a cabin in the woods, a small, isolated place that belonged to her family. She invited me to spend the weekend there, saying it would be a perfect escape from my hectic life. I had been going through a lot recently. A stressful job, a breakup, and feeling generally overwhelmed. I figured that some time alone in the woods would do me good, so I agreed, not thinking much of it. The cabin was a couple of hours away from the city, deep in the woods and miles from the nearest neighbor. Sarah mentioned how peaceful and tranquil it was, how the silence of the forest surrounded the place, and how you could truly get away from everything there. I didn't think twice when I packed up my things and drove out to the cabin, my car making the long drive down winding, narrow roads. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how still it was. The trees around the cabin were thick, towering over the little wooden house, casting long shadows even though it was still mid-afternoon. The cabin itself was beautiful, simple, rustic, with a porch swing and a stone fireplace. It looked like a postcard from a dream, the kind of place people fantasize about when they want to escape from the chaos of their lives. The air smelled of pine and earth, fresh and crisp. Sarah wasn't there yet. She was supposed to arrive later that evening, but I was okay with that. I figured I would take a walk around the property, stretch my legs after the long drive, and get acquainted with my surroundings. I grabbed my bag and set off down the trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The path was uneven, surrounded by thick underbrush and towering trees that blocked out the sun in some places. The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a bird. I breathed in the cool air, feeling some of the tension in my shoulders loosen. This was exactly what I needed. But after about an hour, I started to feel like I was being watched. It was a subtle feeling, a creeping sense of unease that started as a tiny prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I paused, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the woods. I continued walking, but the feeling didn't go away. I started to hear strange noises, the rustling of leaves, branches creaking, distant footsteps that I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just wildlife, that it was probably a deer or something, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, I decided to head back to the cabin. The sun was starting to dip, and I didn't want to get lost in the woods as darkness set in. As I made my way back toward the cabin, I realized that I had wandered much farther than I had intended. I wasn't sure exactly where I was anymore. The path had twisted, and I could no longer see the cabin in the distance. My phone didn't have service, so I couldn't use a map to find my way back. My heart began to race as I picked up the pace, trying to retrace my steps. But the more I walked, the more I felt disoriented. The trees seemed to grow thicker, the shadows deeper. The quiet, which had been so calming earlier, now felt suffocating. I tried to shake the growing sense of panic, but it was impossible. Then I heard something, a faint sound, like a branch snapping underfoot. But it wasn't behind me, it was in front of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest was eerily still, and the wind had died down. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. Still, that feeling of being watched lingered. I made my way back, turning corners in the woods that felt unfamiliar, trying to retrace my steps. After a few minutes, I came to a clearing. There, in the distance, was the cabin. Relieved, I picked up my pace and walked toward it, desperate to get inside. When I finally reached the porch, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I pulled again, but the door was locked. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaky. "Hello?" I stood there for a few moments, but there was no reply. I looked around, hoping for some sign of life, but the woods were silent. I tried the door again, rattling it, but there was no response. It felt like the cabin was completely empty. I wasn't sure why, but I began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Something was wrong. I walked around the cabin to the back door, hoping that it might be unlocked. As I rounded the corner, I froze. There, near the back door, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints. They led up to the back door, and then stopped abruptly, like whoever had been walking had just vanished. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Had someone else been here? Had Sarah arrived and left again? But no. She hadn't called, hadn't sent any messages, and the footprints were too fresh to be from someone else. I wasn't alone. I hurried around to the front again, and this time I tried the window. To my relief, it was open just enough that I could slide it up. I climbed inside, my heart hammering in my chest. Once I was in, I closed the window behind me, my mind reeling with questions. I had been alone, or so I thought. So why were there footprints outside? Why hadn't Sarah answered the door? I went to the living room and turned on the light. The place looked untouched, nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The fireplace was cold, and the couch pillows were still arranged neatly. But that didn't put me at ease. I felt a presence in the room, a heaviness that I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A noise from upstairs, a soft thud, followed by a dragging sound. My heart leaped into my throat. Someone was upstairs. Someone was in the house with me. I froze, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I go up there? Should I leave? I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go and no one around for miles. I was stuck. The thudding continued. Step, drag, step, drag. I crept toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to get out of the house. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. Finally, I made myself move. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The noise from above grew louder. Step, drag, step, drag. It was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could see the door to the bedroom at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open just a little, the dark space beyond it swallowing up the light from the hallway. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go in there. I turned to run back down the stairs, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the doorway. A tall man, his face shadowed by the dark, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. My body went numb. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. The figure took a slow step forward, and in that moment, I finally managed to move. I turned and ran, bolting out the door and into the woods. I didn't look back. The forest was pitch black now, the trees looming around me like dark sentinels. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I kept running, my feet slipping in the wet mud, my lungs burning as I pushed myself forward. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself on a road. It wasn't the road I had driven in on, but it was a road. A passing car finally stopped, and I climbed inside without saying a word. The driver didn't ask any questions, just drove me back to the nearest town. When I finally called Sarah, she was shocked. She said she had never been to the cabin that weekend, that she was out of town with family. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It started with a knock at the door. A single, sharp rap that echoed through the quiet apartment. No one was supposed to be here. Ava sat up on her couch, her heart already racing. The television flickered, casting a dim glow over the room. It was nearly midnight. The apartment complex was silent, except for the occasional creak of the pipes or the hum of the refrigerator. She wasn't expecting anyone, and she certainly wasn't about to open the door this late at night. Another knock. This time, it was softer, almost hesitant. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay still. Maybe it was just her neighbor, Mrs. Kearns. The old woman had a tendency to forget her keys, but why would she be knocking so lightly? And at this hour, Ava reached for her phone and checked the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty, lit only by the dim overhead light. The number on the apartment across the hall seemed to glare at her, stark and unfamiliar in the eerie silence. She exhaled. Maybe she'd imagined it. She turned back toward her couch when her phone buzzed in her hand, a message from an unknown number. Why won't you open the door? Her breath hitched in her throat. Her fingers tightened around her phone. This wasn't happening. It had to be a prank. Another knock. More insistent this time. Ava backed away from the door, staring at it as though it might burst open at any second. She typed quickly, her hands shaking. "Who is this?" she sent. The reply came almost immediately. "You know who I am." Her stomach dropped. She didn't recognize the number, but something about those words sent a cold shiver up her spine. She didn't know who they were, but they knew her. Ava considered calling the police, but what would she say? That someone knocked on her door? That she got a creepy text? They would tell her it was a prank and hang up. Another knock. Harder this time. Almost angry. She forced herself to breathe. The locks were engaged, the chain was latched, no one was getting in. Then slowly the handle twisted. Ava let out a strangled gasp and bolted to the kitchen, grabbing the nearest sharp object, a knife. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, slick with sweat. Her phone buzzed again. "Let me in, Ava." She let out a shaky breath, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Then suddenly, silence. The knocking stopped. The handle stilled. Even the air felt heavier, like the whole apartment was holding its breath. Ava stood frozen, listening. Nothing. Minutes passed. Her legs ached from standing so still. Slowly, she forced herself toward the peephole again, her heart pounding against her ribs. The hallway was empty. She exhaled in relief. Maybe it really had been a stupid prank. Just as she was about to step back, her phone buzzed one more time. "See you soon." Ava barely slept that night. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every creak of the apartment made her stomach twist. But as the sun rose, she told herself it was over. Whoever it was had given up. By the time she left for work, she had almost convinced herself that it had been some dumb joke. A random prankster. A mistake. But then at lunch, she got another message. "You look beautiful today." She nearly dropped her phone. She was sitting outside at a small cafe near her office. There were people around, laughing, eating, talking. But suddenly, she felt exposed. She glanced around. The sidewalk was busy. Faces passed by. Some familiar, most not. Her hands trembled as she typed. "Who are you?" No response. Ava stood abruptly, gathering her things. She needed to get back to the office. She needed to be around people. The feeling of being watched followed her the whole way back. That night, she double-checked the locks. The curtains were drawn, every light in the apartment turned on. She even kept the knife on her nightstand. At some point, exhaustion took over, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. Until the dream. She was standing in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the dark window. But instead of her own face, the reflection was wrong. Twisted. It grinned at her, a wide, jagged smile stretching across two sharp teeth. It raised a hand and knocked. 3 sharp knocks. Ava jolted awake to the sound of knocking at her door. She shot upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. The knocks came again. Her phone buzzed. "Wake up, Ava." She couldn't breathe. She forced herself to move, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. The next message made her blood run cold. "I'm inside." A floorboard creaked behind her. Ava barely had time to react before she felt the breath on the back of her neck. She turned, a scream catching in her throat. But the room was empty. The apartment was silent. Her hands shook as she reached for the lamp, flicking it on. The light chased away the darkness, revealing nothing. She was alone, or so it seemed. Her phone buzzed again. "See you soon." Ava didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, the messages stopped. Ava should have felt relieved, but instead, she felt worse, because she knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. She started noticing things. Her toothbrush was wet when she hadn't used it. Her closet door was slightly open when she always kept it shut. The smell of something unfamiliar in her apartment, something stale like breath. Then the worst thing happened. She came home late one evening, exhausted, and collapsed onto her couch. She went to plug in her phone and noticed something on the coffee table. A Polaroid. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was a picture of her, sleeping. Ava couldn't move. Her blood turned to ice. The photo was taken from inside her bedroom. The air around her suddenly felt suffocating. She wasn't alone. A floorboard creaked, the closet door was slightly ajar, and then the handle twisted. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was close to midnight when Anna finally turned off her laptop. The glow of the screen faded, leaving her alone in the dim light of her small apartment. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. She stretched, feeling the stiffness in her back from sitting too long. Outside, the wind howled through the alley behind her building, rattling the fire escape. Anna wasn't afraid of being alone. She had lived by herself for years and loved the solitude. But tonight, there was a heaviness in the air, something she couldn't quite place. She walked over to the window, peering outside. The city was mostly asleep, the streetlights casting a dull glow over the empty sidewalks. The buildings across the way were dark, except for one window where a faint blue light flickered. Probably a TV left on. She shrugged and turned away, heading toward the bathroom to get ready for bed. As she brushed her teeth, she heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. It came from her front door. Anna froze, the toothbrush still in her mouth. Who would be knocking at this hour? She hadn't ordered anything, wasn't expecting anyone. Her friends knew better than to show up unannounced. Spitting out the toothpaste, she moved cautiously toward the door. Her heart thumped as she placed her ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. Maybe she had imagined it. But then, knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. She inhaled sharply, pressing her back against the wall next to the door. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. Her mind raced through possibilities. A neighbor? Someone lost? Or someone trying to see if she was home? She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she checked the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. A chill ran down her spine. She hesitated before slowly unlocking the door, just enough to peek through the small gap. The corridor was silent, the overhead light flickering slightly. No one was there. She swallowed hard and quickly locked the door again, checking it twice before backing away. Maybe it was just a prank. Kids messing around. Still, she couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. Turning off the bathroom light, she walked toward her bedroom, trying to push the fear aside. Just as she reached the doorway, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of footsteps inside her apartment. She whipped around, her breath caught in her throat. The living room was dimly lit, but she saw no movement. Then, shuffle, shuffle. Someone was there. Anna's chest tightened. She didn't know how they had gotten in, but they were in her apartment. She moved quickly, slipping into her bedroom and locking the door. Her hands shook as she pressed herself against the wood, trying to steady her breathing. Silence. Then a soft creak as if someone had stepped closer. Anna grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. A voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? She opened her mouth to speak, but something stopped her. A whisper, right outside her door. Anna! Her blood turned to ice. She never told them her name. The phone slipped from her grip as terror rooted her in place. The whisper came again, softer this time. Anna, let me in. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart slamming against her ribs. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. The doorknob rattled. She pressed her back harder against the door, her pulse hammering. Then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. She didn't move, barely even breathed. Then her phone buzzed. A text. With shaking hands, she picked it up. The message was from an unknown number. You should have let me in. Anna's stomach lurched. Her eyes darted toward the bedroom window. Slowly, she crept toward it, heart pounding in her throat. She peeled back the curtain just enough to see outside. Standing on the fire escape, just beyond the glass, was a figure. A dark silhouette, head tilted at an unnatural angle. looking directly at her, and then, with deliberate slowness, it raised its hand and knocked on the window. Anna screamed. Everything after that was a blur. She didn't remember unlocking her phone, but somehow she called 911 again. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. The fire escape was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But when she checked her phone again, there was one more message. See you soon. Anna didn't sleep that night, and the next night, just as she began to think she had imagined it all, there was another knock. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It started with a sound, barely noticeable at first. Mia sat curled up on her couch, the only light coming from the television flickering across the dimly lit apartment. It was past midnight, and the rain outside drummed lightly against her windows, creating a soothing rhythm. She was home alone, something that had never bothered her before, but tonight felt different. At first, she thought the sound was just the pipes settling, the way old buildings often creaked when they thought no one was listening. But then it came again, closer this time, and unmistakably deliberate. A soft, shuffling sound, like feet dragging across her hardwood floor. She muted the television, holding her breath. The silence in the apartment stretched unbearably long before the noise came again, a whisper of movement, a soft tap against the wall. Mia's heart began to hammer in her chest. She lived alone. She had locked the door. She was sure of it. She swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. She turned her head slowly, scanning the apartment. The living room was just as she had left it. The kitchen was dark but undisturbed. From where she sat, she could see the entrance, the deadbolt still firmly in place. Then where was the sound coming from? The hallway. The realization made her stomach tighten. The hallway leading to her bedroom was shrouded in darkness. She had left the light off when she came out to watch TV, but now she regretted that choice. She stared into the black void of the hallway, willing her eyes to adjust. She had lived here for 2 years. There were no creaky spots in the floor she didn't know about, no unexplored corners. She had checked. So why did it feel like someone was standing there, just out of sight? Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket she had draped over her legs, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was her neighbor. Maybe she had forgotten to lock the balcony door, and the wind had pushed it open. No. She would have heard that. Another noise. Not shuffling this time, a soft exhale like someone sighing in the darkness. Mia's stomach clenched violently. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't the building settling. Someone was there. She reached for her phone, keeping her eyes locked on the blackness of the hallway. Her fingers fumbled as she swiped at the screen, trying to dial 911. Her hand was shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the device. A floorboard creaked. She sucked in a sharp breath. That was close. Too close. Then silence. Her phone screen glowed, illuminating the living room, and she managed to press call. She brought the phone to her ear, swallowing the lump in her throat. The dial tone rang once, then again, then a third time. A whisper. Mia's breath caught. That whisper didn't come from the phone. It came from the hallway. Then the call connected. 911. What's your emergency? Mia opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the apartment and bolt down the hallway to safety, but fear had rooted her in place. Mia? The voice from the phone was not the 911 operator. It was her own voice. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Mia, why did you call? The voice on the other end of the line was eerily identical to hers. It was soft, familiar, but wrong. Mia's grip on the phone slackened. The voice continued, whispering in her own tone, "You're not supposed to be awake." A sob built in her throat, her mind spinning in terrified confusion. Then, from the hallway, she heard something that shattered the last of her sanity. A second voice. And this one wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside her apartment. It mimicked her perfectly. Mia, why did you call? Tears blurred her vision. She bolted from the couch, dropping the phone in her panic. She sprinted toward the front door, her fingers fumbling at the lock. Click. The deadbolt turned. She yanked the door open just as a heavy thud sounded behind her. She didn't look. She didn't dare. She ran. Barefoot, she sprinted down the dimly lit apartment hallway, her breath coming in frantic, gasping sobs. She had no idea where she was going, just that she needed to get as far away from that apartment as possible. Behind her, the door to her unit stood wide open, and from the darkness beyond, she swore she could hear her own voice calling after her. "Where are you going, Mia?" She didn't stop running. By the time she reached the front entrance of the building, she slammed through the glass doors and stumbled onto the wet pavement outside. A security guard from the night shift came rushing over, his brow furrowed in concern. "Miss? Are you okay?" Mia turned to look up at her apartment window. The lights inside were off, but a shadow stood there, watching her. And as she stared, frozen in horror, she saw her own face staring back at her from the darkness. Then it smiled. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It started with a knock, 3 soft, deliberate taps at the front door. James sat up on his couch, heart pounding immediately. He wasn't expecting anyone. It was nearly midnight. He had just turned off the TV and was about to head to bed when the sound froze him in place. His small, dimly lit apartment sat on the second floor of an old building at the edge of town. The hallway outside led to a single staircase that ended at the main entrance. The building wasn't exactly in the best part of town, but he had never had any real trouble before. Another knock. James swallowed. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone who had the wrong apartment. That happened sometimes. He stood, taking careful steps toward the door. He hesitated before looking through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. A chill crawled down his spine. The sound had been too close. It had definitely been at his door. Maybe he had just imagined it, or maybe they had the wrong apartment and realized their mistake. He let out a shaky breath, shaking his head. It was late. He was probably just on edge because of the horror movie he had been watching earlier. Then his phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "Don't open the door." James' breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping into his chest. His first instinct was to assume it was a prank. Maybe one of his friends messing with him, but he hadn't told anyone he was home tonight. The floorboards outside his door creaked. James stepped back, his pulse hammering. He turned off the lamp beside him, plunging the room into near darkness. Another "I see you." His stomach twisted. He turned slowly toward the window, his mind racing. His apartment was on the second floor, and the only window in his living room overlooked the narrow alleyway behind the building. It was too high for anyone to stand and look inside. Cautiously, he approached the window, keeping his back against the wall. The alley below was empty. Just the usual dumpster and fire escape ladder. His phone buzzed again. "You're not alone in there." James' hands clenched. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold with sweat. He turned his head slowly, scanning the dark apartment. The living room was small, connected to the tiny kitchen. Beyond that was the hallway leading to his bedroom and the bathroom. The shadows seemed deeper, more suffocating. The floor creaked again. But this time it was from inside the apartment. James froze. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. He listened, his ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. His phone buzzed again. "You need to leave. Now." James' chest heaved. Was this some kind of sick game? Someone trying to scare him? Or was it real? He reached into the drawer by the couch, pulling out the small kitchen knife he kept there. His fingers trembled as he gripped the handle. Another text. "He's in the hallway. Don't go to your room." His breath caught. His bedroom door was closed. Had he locked it? He couldn't remember. A soft scrape echoed from the hallway. James took a step back, his mind screaming at him to do something. Call the police. Run. But his body was locked in place. Another sound, this time a whisper, low, garbled, just beyond the wall. James' skin prickled, his phone vibrated. "Get out!" A sudden, sharp knock at his bedroom door made his knees nearly give out. It was inside. James turned, grabbing his keys off the counter. He didn't care anymore. He needed to get out. He sprinted to the front door, fumbling with the lock. The sound of the bedroom door creaking open made his breath hitch. He didn't look back. The door swung open, and he bolted into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The hallway stretched before him, empty and silent. His phone buzzed one last time. Run. James didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the floor. He reached the stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time. His breath ragged. He burst out onto the street, the cold night air slamming into him. He didn't stop running until he was 3 blocks away, standing under the harsh glow of a street lamp. His phone slipped from his shaking hands. He turned back, expecting to see someone following. The street was empty. His apartment building loomed in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless. He didn't go back. Not that night. Not ever. Story the end.